In the summer of '69, overnight, on the whim of a Prime Minister, without debate in the press or discussion in Parliament, 14 private banks were privatised. The feat was repeated in 1980 with 6 more banks being nationalised. Today, public sector banks with total assets of over 70 lakh crore rupees stand at the crossroads. As citizens, we need to reimagine their future. But this time, it must be done with abundant debate across the nation, involving the best minds in the country. CNBC-TV18, the country's premier business channel, has taken up that responsibility to conduct these discussions on catalyzing public sector banks' future. We are calling it PSB 2.0. We kickstart this series with someone who joined government a decade after nationalization and who has seen 3 decades of, may I say, the fall and fall of public sector banks. I have with me Mr. Montek, Ahluwalia, former finance secretary and economist. In a bit, I'm going to be joined by another former finance secretary, Dr. S. Narayan. But first, let's speak with Mr. Ahluwalia. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. Well, straight to the problem. The banking system has close to, say, 10% NPAs, but public sector bank NPAs stand at nearly 15%. There are frauds in all banks, but the biggest one has hit public sector banks. So, is it time to pin the blame on the ownership? Is it time to ask whether the fault lies with the public sector character of these banks?
Well, I think those questions are very relevant, but let me say that the first thing we should question is, why is it that we are having so much larger accumulation of NPAs and also these fraud cases? I mean, there are clear weaknesses there. So even within the framework of public sector ownership, it should be possible to have much better governance of public sector banks and better regulation and better enforcement, so this thing doesn't happen over and over again. More generally, I think we also need to ask the question that, do we need to have such a dominantly public sector banking system, especially when the private sector banking system that we've got seems to have been doing better? I mean, for example, we probably have the largest size of public sector within our banking system, something like 70% or so. Other countries do not have zero public sector presence, but they have a smaller public sector presence and more private sector. So I think we really need to look at what are the deficiencies in governance in the public sector banks. How far are they related to public sector ownership? How far are they related to just poor regulation? But you know, the poor regulation is also related to public sector ownership. I mean, the Reserve Bank is probably in a much better position to regulate private sector banks than it is to regulate public sector banks. I mean, for example, if the Reserve Bank finds something fundamentally wrong in the management of a private sector bank, it can change the CEO. It can't do that with a public sector bank. So I think there are a whole slew of things that we have to look at that will require some rethinking on what up to now has been a very mechanical approach, that we don't want to change our position on public sector banks. And this has been taken by a sequence of governments. This is not just now. I mean, the issue of bringing in a different approach has been there now for the last 15 years, but we've somehow not been able to move forward.
Yes, Mr. Ahluwalia, that's why I'm asking you, is it time to privatize at least some of the PSU banks? Well,
that's a narrower question. There are other issues which are also important, but I certainly feel we need to clarify what you mean by privatize. I think the important thing in the public sector banks is to take government ownership below 50%. I mean, the critical thing is, if the government owns 50% or more, then the bank is subject to all kinds of rules and restrictions by virtue of government ownership. The government could go down to 30%. It could still effectively control the bank, but it would be, the bank managers would be freed from a lot of procedures regarding recruitment, etc. So that's one class of things. The second real issue is, should the government duplicate the work of the Reserve Bank? I mean, this has been there in the literature for some time. You know, public sector banks are actually regulated both by the Reserve Bank and by the Ministry of Finance. Now, in my view, and I've had this for some time, I don't think that finance ministry control over the public sector banks is adding any value at all. I mean, I personally feel that, and this has been recommended, by the way, by expert committees. I think the Narasimham committee way back in 1997 had said that we should take government ownership below 30%, and essentially government can appoint nominees on the board, but they don't have to be government officers. So actually the Department of Financial Supervision, what used to be called the banking division, can even be abolished.
Okay, you know, Mr. Ahluwalia, that is a radical suggestion, but it's come before. The PJ&I committee recommended that, you know, PSU banks should be removed from the Banking Companies Act and moved to under the Companies Act. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, you know, if you want to reduce the government's share in equity below 51%, you will have to do that. Because at present, if that cannot be done unless these acts are changed. So it's not, the real issue is you want to bring government equity below 51%. To do that, you'll have to change these acts.
Okay, well, now let me come to the real problem. Do you see political opposition to this? After all, even the NDA has been able to push its, you know, agenda, Jan Dhan or DBT or farm loans, all through the PSU banks. You know, therefore, they also seem to want, or at least whenever we ask the finance minister, he says there is political opposition or the political environment is not conducive for privatizing public sector banks.
You know, let me say one, I think the finance minister is right that there will be a huge amount of political opposition across the board. Now, let me say that, you know, the Jan Dhan and these other kind of programs, inclusion, and I don't think you need 51% in order to do that. I mean, if the government effectively has, let us say, 35%, it will effectively control the board, and these are strategic decisions which, through the board, the government could get the banks to do. But what you don't want is micromanagement and large numbers of government officials who kind of go on the board of the banks. You know, the present position is totally absurd because every public sector bank has a representative on the board from the RBI and a representative on the board from the finance ministry. And you know, if you say there's a governance failure in the public sector banks, then essentially these two board members become part of the failure. So I mean, it's quite clear that their presence on the board is not making any difference at all. It would be much better in my view. And by the way, we don't have to do this for the entire public sector. I mean, for example, if some banks, like say the State Bank of India, doing a good job, it's a big, huge bank, you don't want to take that up, fine. Let's choose some middle banks, some smaller banks, and experiment.
Let me come to another strategy now which seems to be unfolding. There is an unspoken strategy to just shrink the PSU banks by denying them capital so that by default India becomes dominated by, you know, private banks. You think that's a strategy?
I don't know, by the way, I don't know that that's this. Nobody has said that that is the strategy. So that's a conclusion that you're drawing. But what I am saying is that, you know, rather than pour huge amounts of money to recapitalize the banks, we should decide what we can afford to do. We should not follow the principle, which, I mean, earlier used to be done, that every bank must have capital that will allow it to expand credit by amount X. The really weak banks, they should be put under prompt corrective action framework, and they should be told to clean up the works, reduce costs, cut down branches, all of that kind of stuff. Whatever money we have for recapitalization should go to the better public sector banks, okay? And by going to the better public sector banks, those banks will be able to raise funds from the market, keeping the government equity not below 51. Separately, I really do feel we need to think, why can't we bring it down to 30%? That will require a change in law and probably won't happen before the election. But let's at least have a debate on it.
Well,
you know?
Mr. Alwar, that's exactly what I am trying to have. To start a debate on how do we have to reimagine public sector banks. And what you are saying is that tweaking within this Banking Companies Act is not the way to go. The law needs to change, right?
I'm saying exactly that. I mean, to say that we will dilute but only up to 51% is not good enough. It will not remove very many constraints. I mean, look, one of the constraints it won't remove is constraints on recruitment. I mean, if you're a government organization, you have issues of fairness and how you handle HR and how you promote people, issues of seniority, etc., issues of pay and so on. I don't think you can run a modern banking system as if it was a government department. And I think we better recognize that, and the sooner we recognize it, the better.
That's a clarion call, sir. That's, unadulterated and pointedly putting it. Therefore, looking back, would you say that nationalization of private banks was a cardinal sin, a blunder?
No point going back to 1969. I mean, the big mistake, if you want a mistake, is the most recent one. And the most recent one is that no political party is willing to consider going below 51%.
As a final question, Mr. Ahluwalia, why is it that, as you say, Narasimham committee recommended bringing down stake below 51. Yashwant Sinha spoke about it. It's been politically impossible. Neither the NDA nor the UPA coalitions have pushed privatization. It does look like there is clout that ownership over banks gives political parties. So is it politically very difficult, politically unfeasible to privatize banks?
Well, I'm not competent to judge what constitutes a politically feasible thing, but you're certainly right that no one politically at the moment is for it. Now, mind you, I mean, Yashwant Sinha in Parliament said he wanted to do it, so there was one political voice. Maybe if somebody joined issue on this seriously, you might get a few more. And in these matters, things can change over time. I mean, you have to. I was talking about caste-based reservation. I know that in the staff of the public sector banks, there would be a concern, and a legitimate one, that if you drop it below 51%, will the caste-based reservations go? I think government can make a clear direction that, look, we're going below 51%, but caste-based reservations will not go. And I would say it's worth doing that, in order to get rid of opposition, which is not about banking, but about other aspects of inclusiveness.
Okay, Mr. Ahluwalia, that would be an uneasy piece, but thank you very much for being extremely frank and candid about the need for a change in policy. The key takeaways from this conversation with Mr. Ahluwalia are, and he's a doyen of the Indian financial sector, is that we have to change the law. We need to bring public sector government stake in public sector banks below 51%, and we need to abolish the financial services division in the finance ministry so it doesn't micromanage public sector banks. So, well, three very key takeaways. Let's take a quick break, and we will get another expert like Dr. Ahluwalia will be joined by former Finance Secretary Dr. S. Narayan in a minute when we return.